22 it was. I remember the fish, do you? The angel fish on the tiles in the bathroom. Black and white it was.
It's Time by David Gould. He winds the clock almost reluctantly. He's tied to time, he knows. He'd like to let it wind down so that he can stare at the motionless hands fixed thereafter in one position, their angle capturing the clock's final tock, as if to say, done. He'd like to hear a silence in his house that would quickly settle, allowing him to hear the other voices of his home, listen to the unspoken dialogue that the other objects in his hallway might have to share. He sees the pictures on the wall and passes them daily, but they never utter a word to him like the clock, and he wonders what they might whisper to him if the ticking stopped. But the clock has become a companion. He greets it every morning, as if it stands sentinel in his hallway. It is the reliable, familiar heartbeat of his day, too, slow and steady, as reassuring as his own pulse. He felt safer with the clock. It kept him alert. It said, "Get up, get up, get up," so that he would never lay listless in his bed, wasting the moment in an idle contemplation of the sunshine on his window ledge. It reminded him there were always things to do with its constant, "What now? What now? What now?" It understood him and told him to rest, subtly whispering, "Sit down, sit down, sit down." And as he crept by it at the end of the day, it said, "Good night, good night, good night." For as long as he could hear the clock, he felt safe. He knew he still had time. Each tick implied a tock, and the anticipation of that space of time was essential. Knowing when time was up was always too late. He had to be ready for the moment. He knew he was living in respite. It was only a matter of time before it started again, and they would come once more. They always did come eventually. Time was a cruel reminder of that too, hoarding its horrors in history. Mr. Ash sat on the wooden bench in his garden and took a few moments to rest. The hot sun was burning, sucking every bit of moisture from the earth. He had planted the beans and stared at the row of finely tilled earth, smooth and dark and rich, but turning drier, greyer. Time. That elusive essence, that abstract through which we all move, that we assume is a constant beat and yet fluctuates so easily with our moods. It opens its nefarious jaws to eat into our pleasure and lengthens out our suffering like a sadistic cannibal gnawing at our flesh. Time is never a constant in our mind, because whilst we may experience time in our emotions, we only know it in words. Time disappears when we kiss, he thinks. He remembers. And the kiss is sublime, supreme. But the act of saying 1 millisecond transcends any concept of that reality itself. Why worry about milliseconds if they are gone before you can refer to them? Milliseconds disappear by the million. Yesterday is always dead and gone. It never exists. It is always over. The whole idea of it is futile. And yet we still bemoan our lack of time, Like hungry children, our anxiety craves ever more of it, planning and allocating it precisely, preciously, pedantically. A little here, a little there, not much here and never enough there. Whoever made the first clocks might have thought they had captured time, ensnaring it to control it, to make it their slave, but in fact, the timelessness of each moment was lost, and it enslaved us all. Time descended like a despot and took control, counting the moments, scrutinizing each minute, insisting upon the justification of any act, and demanding accountability and loyalty to its own purpose. We are now mechanically attuned, and we cannot simply be. What next? What next? What next? The transience of it all would tempt us to think that nothing really matters. This agonizing lightness, our being both mentally in the past and peeping into the future, spreads our minds so thin that they are too often, some might say mostly, simply not in the present at all. Mr. Ash paused his thoughts, looked from the dry earth up at the sky, and his ruminations settled on the nature of the question, when? The garden was too dry. He was waiting for rain. It would come in its own time. He decided he may have to water the beans for the first few weeks. It was always a question of when, and not if. It would come, springtime and harvest. They would come. They always did. When he was a child, Uncle Jacob had sat him on his lap and whispered in his ear. He remembers it quite distinctly. Don't trust anyone. Hide. Be ready to run when the time comes. He'd only been 5. Jacob, stop it, you'll scare the boy, his mother had said, laughing and picking him up to make light of the words. She had kissed his cheek and looked lovingly into his eyes that had been filled with sudden terror. But by November of 1938, they had all been forced to accept the brutal truth of Uncle Jacob's words, and in time each one was forced to bow down to Jacob's scarred wisdom. Now he cannot hear glass break, even the slightest tinkling, without his heart rate rising and a sudden unwanted and disturbing loosening in his bow. They had come for Jacob. They had come for Maya. They had come for Ima and Abba. And in the end they had come for him too. He looks at the soil. It is already quite dry on the surface. He will water it and pray for rain. He tried to live in a state of readiness, ready to leave in a moment. The case was in the hallway always. He had food and clothing, he had money, he had that extra too hidden, and he had a picture of Anna, her rings and of course the old photographs, the originals, of Emma and Abba and Jacob. There wasn't a photo of Maya. But ultimately, it was so hard to know when to go. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Leave it too late and you were caught. Too early and you abandoned all that you had built up. Don't go. Don't go. Don't go. That was a problem. No matter how much you prepared, or how much you saved for the moment, no matter how you watched and stood ready, you could never really know when it was time. The clock never said, it's time, because by then it was always too late, too late. You were caught off guard. They'd catch you out and be at the front door before you even got a foot on the back doormat. Mr. Ash had lived at No. 11 Perryhall Road since 1956. On his immigration documents, it says that his name is Noah Ashkenazi, that he was born in Zeliska, southeast of Lviv in Ukraine. But he only has a faint recollection of life in that village. He cherishes a faint memory of the sun burnishing the golden fields and his parents with Uncle Jacob working in the land, silhouetted against its blue, blue skies. By the time he was 6, it was time, and they had moved, starting once more in the Polish town of Lublin, 2 hours from Warsaw. When he moved to England, it had been such a break and a complete evisceration of the past that he became Ash. Mr. Ash. Someone told him that it was a very common tree in England. He liked that. He wanted to fit in after all. And the average British man knew nothing of Ashkenazi or Sephardic Jews. Instead, they would read his name suspiciously, and their eyes would grow wide just at the sight of Nazi, creating a silent, tense moment of doubt every time. It was an echo of a shadowy terror that fell on everyone's ears who heard it too. The word Nazi was visceral in Britain too, even if it was slurred to a more subtle and often Nazi, as Mr. Churchill had pronounced it. The truth was that the last 2 syllables of his surname reminded even him of everything they had done. It was a degradation of all he was, and he could not escape it. The English customs officials reacted brutally but quite innocently to his name, associating it with their own inner terrors. Their knowing so little of Jewish culture meant he did not blame them. The Holocaust of a Blitz was still new to them. The British were new to that kind of terror, and sudden suffering falling on their homes. They had felt safe for so long. They were complacent. Peace only came from readiness, and even that was so temporary. He waters the beans. The sky is empty. Lord, send the rain, he says. When Anna was alive, he was young enough to want things to be different. Even after the ordeals, the loss, and the annihilation of so much of his past. He had hoped to build a home, build a family, recreate a life. The post-war rivalry in Poland saw thousands turn on his brothers returning from the Soviet camps. The window of his tender hope for a new world was shattered, and when bullets began raining down, he did not wait. He was ready. He heeded Uncle Jacob. He grabbed his bag and ran. The Poles had opened the doors, so exit without papers or permits was made easier. He'd heard how the British people of London had picked up literally anything as a weapon to fight the black shirts in their own towns. Even the children had rolled marbles under the feet of policemen and horses who had been called to protect the fascist march. They'd been stopped in Cable Street, and that had been as early as 1936, when they'd settled into the house in Lublin. He thought, why didn't we go there? I could go there now. So in the confusion of thousands of feet moving from country to country, he slipped silently from place to place until he found a ship, and then in the shadows of its hold, he hid. As that ship brought him over the English Channel, he'd emerged and stood on the deck with all the others, craning to see this new land where they might be free. And he'd seen that white, chalky headland as the sun had risen up and broken over the horizon. The land had burned with a golden metallic light, as if the world was on fire and everything was being recast in the Creator's foundry. His heart had been filled, and it surely leapt, when they approached the harbour, for there, over that ancient castle, where a hint of English rain was falling, a great rainbow stretched out like a door to a new beginning. "Hallelujah," he whispered, with tears in his eyes. He had been 17, dressed and clothed in charity and helped and aided by some unknown refugee assistance. He'd slept for the first few nights on the floor of a hall in a church, and then found a synagogue, then accepted a bed in a good man's house for a few months whilst he worked unloading and loading the ships along the Thames. But then, in August 1947, the boiling tensions of the insurgency in Palestine reached British shores. The Irgun had executed and strung up the bodies of 2 sergeants in the growing demand for a free and independent Israeli state. Tension between pro-British army and Zionist groups erupted on the street, igniting a fire that would only grow and spread in the years to come. He felt the tension build and would wake at night, his heart pounding. Is it time, he thought? When a brick had been thrown through his window, glass covered his bed, and his uncle's words returned, "Be ready to run." The hangings by the Irgun group in Palestine had exacerbated everything. Things deteriorated quickly. Britain was turning. The horror of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen was already being forgotten. Even those who were friendly to him in the street or alongside him at work asked him intimidating and probing questions. On good days, he thought they were just showing an interest, but they also interrogated him with their persistent stare and aggravating suspicion. How did you survive exactly? What did you eat? How did you get away? He did not want to face the past. He did not want to be reminded in the daytime too of those nightmare days. So he had had to be evasive, which was exhausting, saying just enough to deter, offering a tidbit to satisfy their hungry curiosity and their macabre fascination with inhumanity. The rioting in London continued, and there were violent protests from both sides, pulling and pushing over a new Jewish question. And yet he was forbidden from migrating to Palestine. Whenever he had accumulated enough money, he'd move. A new room, a new place of casual labour. Unless the sign said, "No Jews," which someone had told him simply meant there were no free rooms. But he'd smiled at the politeness and known the N was negative, and the J started the word for Juden. He wasn't stupid. 9 Juden. Gradually, he was journeying away from the bomb sites, away from the dark shadows of a city that had too many of its own ghosts. He moved south, towards the green fields, and found work in Kent. He picked soft fruit for 10 hours a day and slept in the accommodation on the farms. And he was getting better at speaking and engaging in this new tongue. In 1952 he'd been caught up, like his latest neighbours, in the celebration of a new era, and his world suddenly became red, white and blue. It was an Elizabethan age for a modern world, and they'd watched it all on that little box, even being invited in to see it, as if he was one of them, and he'd stood at the back and tasted the coronation chicken. It was good. It was spicy. People would come and go quite frequently on the farms, but he stayed longer here. There were few he could talk to if they didn't have Yiddish, German, or manage with his very simple English. And the people from London who came down to work in the summer, he could barely understand. They kept themselves to themselves, their families penned into the pickers' homes. And then one day Anna arrived, with her friend Eliana, and an Irish girl they travelled with. Her name was Aileen, which he said was Gaelic for a dream, and he'd laughed. He'd stumbled out a comment to the effect of, "Well, that is you, isn't it? A true vision." And she'd laughed and shook her head. "Yes, a dream," she replied, and laughed. He wondered what was funny until he saw her take Eliana's hand at that moment, and they both smiled. But he was happy for them, and smiled that they had found some affection, or love, or whatever it was. Anna had felt sorry for him, and come and sat with him, talking about the sunset, so the moment had passed. And each night there was another sunset, a late night chat, and a cup of something hot that had been heated on the open fire of the campsite. After the soft fruit was cleared, they had had some orchards to harvest. But the summer was passing too soon, and Noah watched as the grasses grew golden paler, and the haymaking in nearby fields caused some of the pickers to sneeze and their eyes to run. In late September, there was a party to celebrate, the harvest. They'd had a church service of St. Michael's Mass in the village, which he had attended, and sat quietly listening to the great organ thunder through hymns that were strange to him. And in the evening, they'd all sat round a fire outside the corrugated iron huts. Ailing was singing, and when he looked up, Anna was watching him, her eyes bright in the firelight. Someone had brought cider from another farm, and it had been an easy time of rejoicing. But it made him sad. He tried to enjoy the food and the drink and the people's faces, but as he watched the moon passing over their heads through the evening, he knew too that in the morning all this would be gone. "What is it?" Anna had said. "It's nothing," he replied. But his shoulders were heavy, and he looked down into his cider. "It's not the end, you know. We'll be back next year." "A year," Noah says. "That is a lifetime. 1,000,000 lifetimes. Do you have to go?" he asked. "Not if I had a reason to stay," she said, and stepped forward, placing her hand on his. He was never sure if she kissed him or he kissed her, but the kiss happened. He thinks about the kiss now, as he waters the beans on the second day. He can feel her lips on his after all this time. It has never gone, that feeling of first and finest joy. He remembers the warmth in her own lips, and recalls the life that seemed to soar in his veins whenever they touched. "Bless you, Anna," he thinks, as he fills his watering can once more. There is still no rain. He married Anna Solomon on Monday the 5th of April 1954, not even being aware of the desire to marry before the festivities of Passover. He had not been attuned to any orthodox traditions, but there were enough faithful around him now that he did not want to cause offence, even if the strictest of her relatives were most distant and not likely to celebrate marriage with them by attending. The Solomon family had been pleased to avoid the more sedate tone and restrictions during the weeks of what he was told was Serifat Haoma. Afterwards, they had set up their humble home in a top-floor room, with its own bathroom, above the shops in Carlton Parade. They could just about afford the rental if they were thrifty. When he'd completed his apprenticeship in a few months, his earnings would rise. They could look forward, he thought. Soon he would be a fully qualified mechanic, working at the nearby garage, and they could feel a little more settled. It was a start. It was the wedding, he supposed, and the connections and the meetings around it which had blessed them so unexpectedly afterwards. His name had been published to announce the union of Noah Ashkenazi of Cilicia with Anna Solomon in both the Times newspaper and the Jewish Chronicle. He realized that it must have been read by the vast majority of educated English-speaking Jews. His name had been read by someone important at least. Then one bleak Saturday morning, as Mr. and Mrs. Ash sat at the Formica table in their tiny kitchenette, biting into their toast and enjoying the jam made from fruit that had come from the very farm where they had met, the sky had clouded over, and it had gone eerily dark. They assumed it would be a typical English storm, come and gone in a moment. But when the thunder broke heavily overhead, they both jumped as if a bomb had gone off nearby. The rain had been thrown at the windows then, rattling the glass, and startling Noah before he cared to admit it. Soon they could hear nothing but a torrent of water falling and the gushing as it flowed in rivers out of the gutters. At the second thunderclap, there was a crackling of lightning too, and they had both looked at each other in disbelief, and then laughed. "Is this normal?" Noah had asked, as the deluge continued. Then, when the rain had begun to seep, then drip, and then pour through their roof, they panicked to find enough buckets and pans as the downpour fell. "Is this normal?" Anna asked, putting her raincoat on inside the building and pouring a bucket of water down the kitchen sink. The streets were empty of people, but they heard the gushing in the deep gutters of water as the traffic drove by in heavy sighs outside. The old line of St Mary's Cray River, which had run down the high street, was filling quickly and threatening to flood again. It had done just as much only 4 years before. Soon the ducks were swimming beyond the Priory Pond and venturing into an area normally reserved for cars. At some point in the storm, a determined postman delivered his post. But he had to ring the bell 3 times before Noah heard and came running downstairs. "Mr. Ashkenazi," the postman said. "Yes." "Sign here, will you?" The postman held out a form and a pen that just about worked in the damp, and then when Noah had made an attempt at his signature, he placed a slim package into his hands. "Good morning," the postman said, and waded away in his Wellington boots. As Noah stepped slowly back up the stairs, tearing at the seal and wondering what on earth could have come to him in such a dramatic moment, he pulled out a photograph. This stopped him in his tracks. It was black and white, but he'd seen it in colour. There was the familiar blue sky, there the golden fields of Ukraine, there a great green tractor with its dusty wheels, and there, sitting in the seat, was Uncle Jacob. And standing between Uncle Jacob's legs, with both hands on the wheel of the tractor, smiling as if there could be no greater happiness on earth, was Noah, as a little boy. The emotion floods him, so he shakes and his legs tremble, and he is forced to sit down suddenly on the stairs, calling out with a wordless cry. And then he is crying and heaving to breathe, and Anna hears and runs to him. The letter is from a solicitor asking the recipient to make contact, to arrange a visit, to bring identification to the office, if he is indeed the boy in the photograph. The office of Mr. Isaac Goldman is dignified, Spartan almost. There is little evidence of any cultural identity beyond a lithograph of Marc Chagall's La Bastille. The colour and vibrancy of the lovers as they embrace brings a powerful sensitivity and heart to the austerity of grey walls and dark plain carpet. There is no other affirmation of anything beyond a clean-cut, principled regimen. When Noah arrives, Mr. Goldman offers tea in china cups with saucers and a plate of baklava. Anna thinks she might have to wait outside, but she is welcomed in with their rabbi who has come to validate Mr. Ashkenazi's identity. They sit at what looks like a dining table with smart mahogany chairs. "Before we begin," Mr. Goldman says, "may I ask you to do something else?" "Of course, if I can," Noah replies. He had not expected Mr. Goldman's American accent, but since the war numerous opportunities have arisen for legal professionals to assist in overturning some of the injustices of the last 14 years, where there is evidence, where there are people who want to remember, and where there are people who are still alive. I would like you to look at a series of photographs. They're only copies, but I'd like to see if you can help me to identify anyone in them, please. We have to be careful that we don't make any mistakes. I'm sure you understand. I have to be sure you are who you say you are. Oh, yes, of course, Noah says. Thank you, he says, as he takes enlarged reprints of a few photographs from a folder. I wonder, are you able to tell me who any of these people are? Noah picks up the first photograph. It is grey from the enlargement and a little blurred. He scans the faces, the background, the buildings, looking for any clues. It could be the farm in Ukraine, but he is not sure. He doesn't remember a well. He can see the back of a tractor, but it's not like Uncle Jacob's, and the couple are old. He doesn't recall anyone with a beard. He doesn't know them. He is disappointed. He lays the photograph down slowly. I'm sorry, no, he says. I don't recognize them. Should I? There is no should here, Mr. Ashkenazi. What about this one? He says, passing a second over. This one is a young boy, his face squinting in the sunlight, but he holds a ball and smiles at whoever is taking the picture. No, sorry, I have no idea. I've never seen it before. And this one? He holds the photograph, and as soon as his eyes fall on the faces of the people, his hand becomes a little unsteady. He is silent and stares, as if he has emerged from a darkened room and is struggling in a new kind of light. His eyes flicker. He wants to focus, but he can't. His eyes blur. He blinks and flicks away the tears, but it is no use. They flow, and he stalls, dropping his head. Anna looks on, sees the tears streaming on his cheeks, and then moves forward. Noah, she says. It is Abba and Emme at the farm where the green tractor was. Uncle Jacob's farm, I called it. Can you tell me their names, Noah? Mr. Goulburn says. Yes, of course. It is... He struggles to speak, to say the names he has not uttered for such a long time. My father was Yosef Ashkenazi. His wife was Ahava, who was my Emme. He holds the picture up close to him and touches the face. Well done, Noah. And do you know this man? He looks at the next picture and smiles. Yes, yes. It is the man from the tractor in the one you sent before. It is my uncle, Ahava's brother. It's Jacob Ackerman. And this? This is Doda, my Aunt Maya, Jacob's wife. She baked me cookies. Babka. And as soon as the word Babka rolls off his tongue, the emotions break again, and he is crying like a little boy. Mr. Goulburn pauses and allows his Anna to comfort her husband. He pours some more tea and waits. Noah recovers and wipes his eyes. I'm sorry, he says. It was the babka. I suddenly tasted it. I realized I haven't eaten it for so long now. Thank you, Noah. You are doing so well. I know it is very hard for you. Now we need to proceed to the formal bit, if you don't mind. The identification is ratified and the rabbi testifies to Noah's identity, and in the formality of the words, it allows him time to become calmer. Mr. Goulburn then stands and moves to a filing cabinet against the wall. He draws open the middle door. Afterwards, Noah will remember the sliding of the drawer, the runners, and the sudden clunk as the drawer stops. It is interesting, Noah recalls when he is much older, how sound punctuates time, structuring each of his significant moments. A door closing, a drawer opening, a tiny click, a shot, Each sound is like a full stop closing the actions of departure or discovery or death. At times a chorus of lighter sound might echo in his mind to remind him of the flowing joy of song that he has heard from the mouths of loved ones that well in his heart now, or the broken cries of his mother stuttering in her weakness that can still grip him with sudden terror even today. He calms himself with other sound now he is older. The easy friendship of the clock's slow minutes is reassuring. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. And it reminds him again of Uncle Jacob and his exhortation to be ready to run when the time comes. Mr. Goldman had produced a steel box, like a large safety deposit box. It was brought out and placed on the table. He said nothing, allowing Noah a little more time before the next revelation. "What is it?" Noah asks. "It is from your uncle. It was his security, an ark of providence in the face of the coming storm. We believe that when your family sold the farm and moved to Poland, that he gathered the pictures and placed them in a bank." Mr. Goldman opens the lid of the steel box and removes a leather-bound book that looks like a ledger. It is an album. When he opens it, it creaks slightly like a door that has remained shut for too long. It is clearly a collection of family photographs. A few are the originals of what he has just seen, but here there are more. There is the farm at Zeliska, pictures of Noah as a baby and a boy, pictures of his parents on their wedding day with what must have been their own families. Another of a family in a kitchen where a feast is being eaten, and there are so many smiling faces. And there is another of his father and Jacob sitting in the lower branches of a tree while he sits astride a bough. In one picture, there is his mother in her garden, next to a flowering shrub she loved. It blooms, looking like trumpets. "That is my mother, in her garden," he says. "Yes," Mr. Goldman says, "we have that same shrub at my home in the States, an hibiscus. It is a beautiful purple in the summer, the rose of Sharon." The rabbi speaks up now. He quotes the prophet Isaiah, says its flower is to provide for the mourners in Zion, to give them beauty instead of ashes. The rose of Sharon is believed to be a flower among thorns with healing qualities. Its oil is used on wounds. Hallelujah! The next photograph shows a family group on a large sofa or settee. Everyone is there, so they must have got a neighbour to take it. The mood is formal, and the smiles look subdued or forced. It may even have been the last picture of the family at the farm. And the final picture is perplexing at first, but also shocking. It is terrible in the light of what we now know followed in the next few years. The next picture is the same room, but without any of the people. It is chilling, prescient. He has taken it as if he wanted to remember the place as it was, the empty room. But it is also a picture of the loss of each one of them. Here 1 minute, gone the next. Noah is silenced. He has gone cold. He stares at the empty picture. "It's beautiful," Noah says as he closes the album, "mostly." He rests it on the table. "And it's yours," Mr. Goldman says. It's your inheritance. Noah smiles and Anna puts her hand on his arm. After all this time, she says, it is so precious. Mr. Goldman waits as if he is expecting something, a question, an observation, something else. But aren't you a little intrigued, Mr. Ashkenazi? Mr. Goldman then asks. Intrigued, Noah says, and waits. Of all the other people I have helped to reconnect with the few things that were hidden away, saved, and placed into silent caches, this is the only one that has stored a simple photograph album. For most people, they hid gold, silver, rings and money. Why would your uncle put a family photo album in a safe deposit box? Yes, I know that the pictures were important and that they are a real treasure to you now, but he can never have known what was coming. No one could have foreseen the terrible annihilation of the Shoah and assumed that the pictures would become so valued. Why save this? Noah looks back at the last photograph. There's the settee, the window, a few pictures on the wall with the fussy light fittings, the rug on the floor. He'd forgotten that. It was a woven design of browns and reds and greens, all in a modern geometric design that was quite luxurious. And the Russian vase on the sideboard ornate with roses, making a wreath around a picture of someone in a boat. It all seems to come back to him now, and the smell of someone's tobacco too. Who smoked the pipe? He can't remember. Was it just Abba or Jacob too? And then slowly the sounds flood his mind. The laughter and Maya and Emma's knitting needles clicking as they talked, and underneath it all, in the background, yes. Then he remembers. The chiming clock. He can hear it then, chiming each hour and resonating in the room like a hum, marking the time, making the time real. There, in the corner, is the large casement clock. The clock, Noah says. It's not a picture of the empty room, it's a picture of the clock. There. I don't remember whose it was, but it was important. They would mention it and talk about it all the time. Jacob would wind the clock and tend it. I once hid something in it in a game and he told me off for opening the case. I'd completely forgotten that till now. Perhaps he took a picture of the clock because he had to leave it. Mr. Goldman smiles. This pleases me, he says. I do like some happiness in the endings, he says. He didn't leave it, Noah. Your uncle kept the clock. He took it with him to Lublin. We know because we have the records, and the Germans who took over their house kept the paperwork. It is an important clock. It was expensive when they bought it. Then the German officer who acquired it, shall we say, kept it safe. In fact, he paid to have it maintained. We have the records. Not only that, we have the clock itself. It survived. It was found in storage in a warehouse in Bremen, and now we have traced it back to you. So we have the clock, and now we have you. Your uncle's treasured clock will be coming to you, returning to its rightful owner. Noah's smile is tentative at first, born in disbelief, and then he is noisy and effusive in his expression, like a new baby suddenly aware of life. But what of the first pictures? Anna asks as Noah looks again at the album, his hands touching the images on each page. Oh, that was a little test, Mr. Goldman says dismissively. I always use a decoy at the start to gauge the people who come to me, just to be sure of them, I'm afraid. We cannot know who is coming along to claim all of the treasures that we have sadly accumulated. There are many unscrupulous treasure hunters out there, all claiming that they definitely know the couple in that picture and how they used to play with that little boy with a ball. It's always their grandparents or their great Uncle Ezra back in Poland or Germany, or little Saul with a ball. And do you know who they are? Of course. It's my mama and papa back in Illinois, and that little boy is me. When the clock finally arrives in their flat, they place it in the living room area. They have to push a bookcase right in the corner to make space, and it looks squashed. It protrudes into the room, demanding your attention, and it feels like an uninvited guest. After it has settled, Noah winds the mechanism, and they hear its spring tighten, the torque building with each twist, until the rhythmic ticking suddenly claims and invades the room. That's good. That's good. That's good. And they both smile as they watch the minute hand magically move. A day or two passes, and the clock's presence, at first an overwhelming joy, seems a little too intrusive. It dominates. What now? What now? What now? Its tick is part of every conversation, and they find themselves speaking louder over the constancy of the mechanism, becoming a little more irritable with each other. And after winding the clock's chime and not sleeping in the first week's enthusiasm, they let the chime wind down. Even when they endure its heavy tick-tock, tick-tock, struggling to get to sleep until they close their eyes in frustrated exhaustion. One morning, Noah stubs his toe on its casement, causing him to swear. "Noah," Anna says. She has never heard her husband swear like that before. "Well, I'm sorry, but it really hurt," he says. And it bruises badly. That evening, Noah drops the Antiques magazine on the table. "I've been having a little look," he says, "and I think the clock may be valuable. I think Uncle Jacob was saving the clock because he knew he could sell it, that it was worth a lot of money. We could possibly even get enough for a deposit on a house." "Oh, Noah," Anna says, "are you really sure?" "Well, just look at it. It doesn't fit in here. It's noisy and looks ridiculous shoved in between everything else. It's not part of our life here. It's just the past haunting us. And we could do with the money. It would be better all round if we just sold it." Anna looks at her husband's face and wonders if he really believes what he is saying or is simply being practical. If it were her own grandfather's clock, she knows she would never want to sell it. That night Noah cannot sleep. He thinks about the clock. His mind is filled with images from the album, and he hears the sounds from the lounge from the past. He imagines his parents sitting on the settee in the farmhouse and wonders what Uncle Jacob would say if he knew that he was considering selling his treasured clock. From the other room its tick-tock, tick-tock permeates his consciousness, and when he awakes, it is the words, "Do not, do not, do not," that he thinks he hears. After another week they cannot decide. He has let it wind down so that he can think clearly. Their rooms are silent now. There is a strange emptiness about the place, like a new loss. Anna wonders if he is preparing himself for its departure, as his grief for the past has become more real since the clock's arrival. She knows that he is struggling. He does not speak. He, too, has become silent. Anna picks up the magazine and reads an article in the clock maintenance section. She looks at it and wonders if they need to get a specialist to check it and make sure it's all working properly before it's valued. And if he's going to sell it, it will need a jolly good clean, she thinks. She is careful. Just a soft cloth. Nothing abrasive. When she opens the casement door, she is shocked at the dust and the debris trapped in the edges and corners of its interior. There are thick black cobwebs too, that hang inside like some invasive growth wrapping itself around its intestines. She gets a soft brush to remove the spider's webs, barely touching anything and watching carefully as the mechanism shifts silently to her touch. Then she gets the pipe on her vacuum cleaner and sucks out the dust, the debris in its base. When she has finished, she takes a damp cloth and wipes around the insides, being careful once more not to touch the mechanism. At the base, though, there is a lip, and she has to push her fingers under to push the cloth into the slight recess. She wipes along, and then she feels the slightest ridge, and she pushes the cloth over it, and it moves. A faint depression, and a sudden click. When Noah walks in that evening, he is quiet, and she hears his heavy feet climb the stairs, each one a labour, as if he is reluctant to proceed any further. He enters the kitchen, cheerless and tired, but she is there, standing by the sink, her face alight. "What?" she says. "You can't sell it," she says. "You don't need to sell it." "Why? What have you done?" he asks. "Oh, nothing. Just come with me." And she leads him to the clock. She tells him to open the casement door, put his hand in, feel for the lip, find the raised button, press it, click. Then, with the click, the flooring of the casement is released. It rises like a school desktop, and there, underneath, is a hidden space. "Put your hand in," she says, a smile breaking across her face. And he does. When he withdraws it, he is holding a small bag, its top closed tight with threads. "Open it," she says. And he does. And then there, in his hand, are 6 exquisite diamonds, each as big as a split pea. By the time they move into No. 11 Perry Hall Road, Anna is heavily pregnant. Noah is so happy. Things happen so quickly sometimes. When he had kissed her after finding the diamonds, he had been transformed. It is another kiss that he will ever remember. He could keep the clock, they could afford to move on and find a bigger place, and they are both smiling once more. In the front garden he has planted the largest rose of Sharon he could find, and it thrives. Its flowers open to catch all the glory of the sunlight that blesses their home. Each time he passes it, he blesses his mother. He buys a ceramic Star of David, decorated with bright mosaic tiles, and hangs it outside their front door, and they name their house Shalom. Slowly, they begin to dwell in a little more confidence, in this peace that settles over their comfortable new life. The clock stands in the hall. Just before sunset each Friday, Noah takes the key and winds it. And as with each turn, he thanks the Lord for what has come to him. He blesses Abba, Emma, Meir, and Jacob, and he is thankful every day for Anna and his home, for the baby that is coming, and he counts his every blessing. But he is also haunted in the sonorous echo that hums on the clock's chime. He remembers faintly the solemnity of those words, "Be ready to run when the time comes." And there always is now in the hall his brown leather suitcase. His emergency escape is ready. Clothes and documents and money and copies of the photographs packed in envelopes, a torch, maps, all he needs to run. He's ready now to run. He will always be ready. And the clock reassures him. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. Each day he passes the second case that waits in the hall. Anna has packed this one. There are clothes for her and the baby, nappies, muslins, sanitary things and her wash bag, her dressing gown and the slippers he has bought her. The clock says, "Not yet, not yet," and he goes to make a cup of tea. They are both ready to run. They have planned it, the route. Who might give a lift at different times, what the taxi number is, and if all else fails, the ambulance. It is a Wednesday in the end. It's Mrs. Driscoll from No. 17 who comes to call him. He's under a Ford Anglia when he hears, "She's gone into labour. She's on her way to the hospital. Noah, you need to go." He slides out. The voice in his head says, "It's time, it's time, it's time." And he hears the clock tick faster, like his heart pounding rapidly, but he suddenly does not feel ready to run. He freezes, panics, looks at his hands, sees the black oil, sees that dirt, wipes them, then hears Mrs. Driscoll, "Come on, lad, run, run!" And he just runs. As he made his way to the hospital, his heart racing, Noah had imagined Anna's face. She had been worried for the previous few weeks. She'd been afraid of what might happen. He had smiled and acted gently, seeking to reassure her at every twinge, every sudden kick from the little one, his words wanting to ease her anxiety, that it was normal. He reminded her daily of all they had done to make things ready, to make their way into the next day as straightforward as possible, to be prepared for the moment when they would have to leave the house, travel a few miles to the ward. It would all be just so. They would simply move, react, go. But he too had quietly thought about the urgency and the need to run. We like to tell ourselves that any action is a simple moment unfolding, like the petals of the rose of Sharon as they unfold in God's time. And we tend to think that big moments like birth or death are intruding in our humdrum lives. So the throwing of stones and the breaking of glass seems unusual and shocking to us. The violent gathering of people to inflict suffering is a strange phenomenon. But there have always been wars and killing and death. There is nothing new under the sun. But it is no more unusual than the falling of rain. Rain comes. Trouble falls. But the sun also rises, as the prophet says, and every baby slips from its mother's womb to cry and glorify the brand new day. But however ready they were, readiness is not the only thing that determines the final outcome. Noah may have built his ark and waited for the rain, but it was God's hand that finally closed the door. And not every flower on the rose of Sharon blooms. Sometimes the frost comes first. He did run. He got there quickly, only to be told that he must wait outside with the other men, sitting, standing aimlessly in their fear in the corridor, all watching the long dark hands on the metal clock in the waiting room with its grey enamel face and those big black spidery numbers. Its ticking grew louder and more anxious in his head as he paced and paced and paced. It's time. It's time. It's time. Once before he had stood with so many others, waiting in the lines, in a corridor of what seemed like a hospital, like the makeshift wooden buildings of Orpington Hospital with its regimental rows. It was so militaristic, and the adults had been tense then too. So he'd hidden in his fear, crouching at their feet, moving himself closer to the earth, to bury himself if he could. And they'd had to undress and hang their clothes so carefully, as if it was the most normal thing to do. So he hid. He buried himself in their clothes. There was nothing of him by then anyway. He was not coming out until he could just leave. He hid in the fabric of those people, listening and waiting for any moment when he could just run away. And this is what he remembers as the other fathers drift off one by one and disappear behind other doors, so that in the end he is left alone in the waiting room. And his heart's desire had faded with the lengthening hours and the growing anxiety of what was happening behind that door where she had entered and he did not go, with its sudden screams and the unexpected, terrifying cry of gas! More gas! Before, when the noises had stopped, he lay in a stillness that seemed to settle, like that moment after thunder breaks and the air returns so fresh and new, and you breathe it in because you can think and say, I'm alive. I'm still alive. And a man had come, not a kind man, and he had kicked him, told him to stand up, hit him with his stick. Then he had to pick up the clothes, a whole room full of clothes. And he'd waited for a second, taking in the numbers of the people who no longer needed their clothes, till he felt the stick hit his back with a sudden crack, and another barked command. So he had fallen quickly to picking up each piece of clothing, so many clothes. He started to look at each one to begin with, thinking if he could remember whose they were. Sasha's, Solomon's, David's, Joel's. But the man growled a command, so he started shoving them in the big basket, grabbing handfuls and running quicker and quicker to the basket to get more and more. And all the while the man just stood there, his face full of nothing, like a mask with its lifeless eyes. And when he'd done that, wait by the door. Outside noises had suddenly startled. A shot, first one, then more, and frenzied shouts and running, and the man had turned and looked. He'd drawn his pistol then and looked at Noah, whose eyes opened wide and was startled. Noah remembers looking into the dark emptiness of the pistol's barrel, waiting. It's time. It's time, he told himself. But the louder shots had broken the man's mask, and he had turned and run. The noise of shouting and shooting grew closer, with shot after shot and rattling bullets from bigger, more threatening guns. So he climbed in the basket and hid beneath the clothes, thinking about everything that had just happened. And he clung to Uncle Jacob's words. Hide. Be ready to hide when the time comes. And he stayed there until it was silent again, until it was all over. Noah stands outside the door in the hospital. He watches the people who come and go in uniform. Their faces are cold and hard to read, as if they mask what is happening. And he waits. And he waits. Then he remembers their faces and their lips moving. But the words have been lost. Their mumbled expressions have faded over time. And all he hears in the end, all he remembers now is, she's gone. She's gone. She's gone. They had discussed names, of course, settling on Samuel for a boy and Sophia for a girl. And it was a little girl. She would have been Sophia. But Sophia had disappeared, unseen, and she'd gone with her mother. When he had heard that, he had stood, silenced in the unbearable pain, his eyes awash with the deluge of grief and the sudden overwhelming loss. He had torn his clothes then, ripping his shirt and shaking as if in a rage, as if to voice some wordless angst and release the fire burning in his heart. When he'd walked into the house afterwards, The loss had descended. He placed the bag she had packed down in the hall. It was redundant. He wept as he placed his shoes next to hers. They would sit there waiting for feet that would not come. And he'd wept as he tried to hear the tiny feet of Sophia. But he had never heard what her pattering was like, and he could not imagine her tottering along the hall to come to her Abba. He'd wondered if he could stay in that home they had begun. He thought of running to a new place, away from the memory of her that flooded his mind. He'd stood and looked down the hall to the door where the sun shone through the glass and warmed the day, and behind him the clock was waiting. It had spoken to him and told him to be patient. There, just wait, just wait. He is 78, alone. He remembers it is his birthday, thinking about how old Anna would have been. He watches the news as the voices grow in hatred once again, throwing words like stones to despise who he is. He wipes the dust and grime from the Star of David by his door. He keeps the suitcase packed in the hallway, but he will not run now, even if they were to come and smash every one of his windows. He is too old. Let them come. Let it all come. What can I do? He takes to his bed, calls a friend for help. Mrs. Friedman visits. She brings meals and checks on him, cleans his clothes. He's left the key on a string by the front door letterbox so she can reach in and enter, but she has made a copy just in case. He can walk no further than the garden anyway. Sometimes she finds him kneeling in the dirt burying seeds. At other times he is burying things from the house. Once a silver spoon, another time a glass bead that he had found. The beans he had planted dry and shrivel. They had not been watered, and the sun has been harsh in recent days, heating the air so that Mrs. Friedman said the people on the radio had been talking about a drought. He lies in his bed under a sheet for long days now. He hears the clock. It reassures him. Not yet. Not yet. Not yet. But it seems to be getting slower, as if the sound itself struggles to climb the stairs. He coughs occasionally, as if it is now an event, and he breathes slowly when the coughing comes and goes. Every breath is shallower. From his bed he hears the people coming. It is dark already, but he can hear noises from the street. A bicycle, a car moving on, and then another vehicle passes, and another. Someone is saying good night, a dog barks, and a voice somewhere sings a line from a song. In the house, he hears the clocks ticking, slow. It's time. It's time. It's time. From the hallway he can hear the sound of Mrs. Freeman putting the key in the front door. "Morning, Noah," she calls, and he hears her step coming. 1, 2, 3. Tick, tock. It's time. Tick, tick. Done. Mrs. Friedman looks up at the clock as she enters. It's been running a little slow, she thinks, and can't remember when she wound it last. Then she notices the silence. The clock has stopped. just after 6:25. The angle between the hands is 23.5 degrees. Give or take a minute.